Welcome to the Wordy Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
All right, hello and welcome. This is the Wordy Pair Podcast, and today we are talking about Grimm's fairy tales, or at least that's going to be our jumping off board. I'm Rudy.
And I'm Justin.
And we have no idea how well this topic is going to work, but Grimm's fairy tales are kind of like one of those... How would you describe them? They're kind of ubiquitous, aren't they?
They're... Oh, okay, well, let's get something out of the way really quick here. I think that Grimm's fairy tales are some of the greatest and some of the original trolls. The greatest trolls and original trolls of all time. Definitely in a top 10, at least. Which is something that will be made clear, or should be made clear to anyone that reads them, because they are very, very snarky. And yes. they often have a both a sense of wit and a sense of humor behind them, which might have...
and a sense of irony as well.
Yeah, most of the stories have a sense of irony as well. Not all of them, but most of them.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of stories, so I have a collection that is like 400 stories, something like that. Between two and... How many stories is this collection that I have? It's a large number. It's in the hundreds.
Yeah, there's tons of stories, because there's a lot of them, and some of them are really short. There's very few that are more than a couple of paragraphs, you know.
So I have a copy of Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales that has 211 stories in it.
Well, let's get
we read a few of them, not all of them, for this episode, but you know, we kind of got a random sampling, basically.
Yeah, we're basically gonna milk these fairy tales for when we need to fill.
Yeah.
Gotta fill some podcasting space here. But
well, I mean, we've been doing a lot of stuff about movies and things like that, and so we need to get back into doing some writing, and we need to be doing some stuff that requires a little bit of reading on our part. Was kind of my opinion, because we're just kind of like, we've been doing a lot of random blah 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 about like some topic of randomness, but
yeah, well, if we're gonna go that route, then let me get it out of the way really quick. If you want a good visual way to experience some Grimm's fairy tales, there was a 1980s, I believe, anime series called Grimm's Fairy Tale Adventures, which aired in Canada and America. And so there are English versions of it out there. And I believe Discotheque Media or someone released a new DVD or Blu-ray of most of the collection.
Okay.
Because they were kind of the English translations were kind of lost to time. They were when they went to make the new release, the company actually had to outsource to people that had old VHS copies and whatnot laying around so that they could get the footage.
Yeah.
But if you happen to speak Japanese, the original Japanese run is apparently fully intact in Japan and is available there. So there's two ways to experience it from a visual medium that I fully recommend. And having said that, we'll jump away from movies and anime and whatnot for a minute here to just talk about the books.
Yeah, so I mean, it's the Grimm's fairy tales have been told and retold over the years, and they've kind of gotten, compared to the original Grimm's fairy tales, the ones that you will hear, generally speaking, are abridged, which is surprising for a 2-page story, as well as largely softened for modern ears, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, there's there's like Cinderella was very Disney-fied. Snow White was another one, another Disney-fied one. But there's lots of stories that, like one of my favorites was always The Brave Little Tailor, and that's been done a couple of different times by various, retellers. And the originals are usually a little bit harsher in tone, a little more sarcastic, a little more violent usually than you'll get out of a lot of the like modern reworks of fairy tales are usually not presented as quite so violent because people think that kids can't handle a handful of words that say, and he cut off the giant's head. Which,
right.
I mean, I read that stuff all the time when I was a kid. I don't know about you, but it was nothing traumatizing. It was just like, oh yeah, there were these bad giants and someone made them less bad.
Yeah.
Turned them into giant hulking carcasses of meat. No big deal.
So I actually read The Gallant Tailor today.
Yeah,
so
they have different titles, by the way.
Well, because they're all being translated out of German, so.
Yeah, and I think there's actually, like I'm looking at my copy right now, I think there's actually 2 Tailor stories in here. There's The Giant and the Tailor, and The Tailor in Heaven.
Well, so I have The Gallant Tailor and The Giant and the Tailor, and there's probably other Tailor stories.
Yeah, but the Tailor story that I recall was called The Brave Little Tailor, and it was just a story that was about a tailor who was incredibly confident, and being confident.
It's the 7 in 1 blow guy, right?
Yeah, and it's basically a story about how his confidence, helped him to a happy life. Confidence
and ingenuity is the thing. Yeah.
Oh, ingenuity is also something that is very present throughout these stories. Like the ones that you handed me to read that we prepared for. My favorite one was Clever Gretel. For reasons which I'm sure are obvious to you, but we can talk about that in a minute. However, before we get going, just to give an idea of what I mean when I say that these are the original troll stories. Just before we started recording this, I came across this little gem. It was called The Golden Key, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it. It's really short.
Oh yeah, I've read this one too, yes.
In the wintertime, when deep snow lay on the ground, a poor boy was forced to go out on a sledge to fetch wood. When he had gathered it together and packed it, he wished, as he was so frozen with cold, not to go home at once, but to light a fire and warm himself a little. So he scraped away at the snow, and as he was thus clearing the ground, he found a tiny gold key. Hereupon he thought that where the key was, the lock must be also, and dug in the ground and found an iron chest. If the key does but fit, he thought, no doubt there are precious things in that little box. He searched, but no keyhole was there. At last he discovered one, but so small that it was hardly visible. He tried it, and the key fitted exactly. Then he turned it once round, and now we must wait until he has quite unlocked it and opened the lid, and then we shall learn what wonderful things there were lying in that box.
Yep.
The end.
Yeah. This was the fifth story in the list that I read today. And that one got me for being just so incredibly short all of a sudden. Because I had just finished reading The Little Farmer and the Gallant Tailor and the Giant and the Tailor, which are, well, the Giant and the Tailor is fairly short, but the Little Farmer and the Gallant Tailor are relatively long. And then this one paragraph story hit. And it's funny that there's no resolution to it. That it's just like, hey, we'll learn what's in the box, and then you don't.
Well, I mean, this is joke writing. This is like, really, really like filtered down joke writing in that they present this setting, and usually when you present some kind of setting and you describe a few actions, all of the things that are happening at that moment are going to play a very important part in what unfolds in the story. But then all that unfolds is, we're not really going to tell you what's in the box, so yeah.
It's like Chekhov's gun, and the narrator's like, and Chekhov's gun was a very nice gun. The end. Well, so the other thing here is that this story has a lesson about attention to detail. And that's what I'm kind of seeming to get from it, is that it's like, well, at first this box doesn't appear to have a keyhole, But upon further inspection, upon closer inspection, you find that it has a keyhole. And we do, the story does say that there were wonderful things lying in that box. And so I think the moral of this story is that good things come from attention to detail, basically.
I mean,
yeah, it's a fun little paragraph.
I like to get on the case of Asian fairy tales a lot because they tend not to really have any direct meaning behind them, but sometimes the Grimm's fairy tales got them beat in that regard.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that they're well, it depends on which Eastern fairy tales you're talking about, but some of them I think were probably written by people who had read Grimm's fairy tales and were trying to imitate it.
Yeah.
So it's understandable that there's a little bit of is there a moral to this story or not? I mean, one of the things that has happened in the time since Grimm's fairy tales has come out is that the stories have been kind of curated and they've been given a moral, turning them from fairy stories more closer into something like Aesop's fables, right? Where Aesop's fables all had a distinct, moral of the story, whereas these do not. But I think people kind of mix them together a little bit because it was better for children to get stories that had morals to them. At least that was probably the idea that people had. And so, just to give an example, there's a story that we read called The Elves. And the actual story of the elves has 3 parts. But the only part that you ever really hear about these days is the first part. Because the other 2 parts don't really have a moral.
Yeah, it's just here's some more of what happened in the story. Anyway, it's a happy ending. Have fun.
So let me summarize this for everyone real quick. The elves is the first part of the elves is the elves in the shoemaker story that you've probably heard. The shoemaker is diligent and he puts all his patterns out and cuts the shoes out and leaves them at night, and he wakes up and the shoes are done. And then he leaves out 2 sets of shoes that are almost done the next night, and he wakes up and the shoes are done, and then 4. And then he makes himself relatively not wealthy, but well-to-do based off of this process. And finally, he says to his wife, let's figure out what the heck is making these shoes. And so they wait and hide, and they leave the stuff out, and they watch, and 2 elves come in, and they finish the shoes and go away. And, this is usually kind of how that story is told, is that basically the tailor then makes clothes for the elves, and the elves... And in the versions that I've heard before I read it, it's usually there's some kind of, mutually beneficial arrangement that happens there where they keep working together. But in the actual story, the elves just go away after they get the clothes. They make them small clothes, and the elves come in hey, cool, small clothes, and then they go away and they never come back. However, from that time, they were never seen again. But it always went well with the shoemaker as long as he lived, and whatever he took in hand prospered. Okay, it's kind of a very low level, kind of weird karma story, honestly.
Well, yeah,
but that's just part 1. Part 2 is just a story, just a very short 2-paragraph story about a maid who gets sent to be a godmother for an elvish birth, and there's time dilation, and she comes back, and it's 7 years later, but it was only 3 days for her. There's no moral there. and probably that story nobody has ever heard. And then number 3 is even more off the wall, because basically step 1, elves take a child away from its mother and leave a changeling in place. The changeling is not good for anything. It just eats and drinks like a glutton. And then the woman talks to her neighbors. They tell her to take the changeling into the kitchen and boil water in eggshells, and then the changeling laughs. And that causes elves to come pick up the changeling and return the child. There's no... I had never heard this story before, but it is completely... if there is a moral to it, the moral is ask advice from people if you have a strange problem.
These aren't really written with the intent of giving morals necessarily, but they do have that...
Well, some of them are. Like The Brave Little Tailor is.
Yeah, but they're not all... I mean, I would say that probably not even half of them really have any moral per se, other than, like you said about having a bit of karma to them. You also asked me to read King Thrushbeard, which is which is one of the more timeless tales of someone who is very uptight and gets taught a bit of humility, and then people forgive her, and Yeah, things
Happily ever after.
happily ever after or whatever. And happily ever after is not like constant throughout Grimm's fairy tales.
Oh no,
Although
no.
it seems like the ones that we chose to read this time tended to land that way.
Well, kind of, sorta. We had some very violent stories in the ones that I just chose at random, and well, we'll get to that. But anyway, more on King Thrushbeard.
Yeah, well, I mean, all that happens in King Thrushbeard, and it's one of the longer ones we read, but it really
Yes.
it's just this this princess is turning up her nose at everyone her father brings to marry her, and she especially insulted another king named King Thrushbeard.
Well, she created that name for him.
Oh yeah,
basically.
that's right. And so the king kicks his daughter out, and since she wouldn't take a husband, just basically,
Well, so he basically this is one of the weird things that happens in these stories that like I'm not. This is some cultural thing that I'm not aware of, but people make these strange oaths to themselves and then feel duty bound to fulfill them, no matter the personal cost.
Yeah.
So basically, the king says, "Oh, you don't like any of these noble suitors that I brought? Okay, I vow to give you to the the lowest born person that comes to look for you next." And it turns out that it's some beggar guy, or no, it's a ballad singer. And the king's like, "Here, ballad singer, have my daughter." And the ballad singer's like, "Oh, okay, I guess."
Fine. I mean, yeah. So she goes back with this ballad singer, and they sit in their little hovel, and he decides to put her to work, and she's utterly useless. Can't do anything. Can't even sell pottery, and then someone tramples the pottery anyway, and so she costs this guy a ton of money. This poor old beggar, this ballad singer has no way to really do anything with her, and he just keeps insulting her and putting her through more and more. And then finally she gets to work in some other kingdom's scullery, which happens a lot in these stories. There's always these women that fall on hard times and end up working in the scullery of some kingdom. Usually, 9 times out of 10 that happens. You can bet she's going to marry a prince or something. Well, in this story, it turns out that the king is actually the ballad singer who was pretending to be this ballad singer because he wanted to marry her, but he also wanted to teach her humility.
So she's the daughter of a king.
Yeah.
King Thrushbeard disguised himself as the ballad singer / beggar, also disguised himself as the horse soldier that broke all of her pots.
Yeah.
And then he's like, and then basically he takes her to her old home. And she has to be a scullery maid at her old home where she used to be a princess, which is like doubly humiliating. And then all of a sudden he's like, "Hey, I love you, and I disguised myself as these things to teach you humility."
Wait,
the end.
It was her own kingdom? Did I forget that?
Yeah, it was her own kingdom.
There were like several stories where someone went to work in a scullery, so...
Yeah, it happens a lot. No, it's funny, because I have been asking at your father's castle if they want a kitchen maid, and they say they don't mind taking you. At any rate, you will get your victuals free. It's like, so you're going to take me from home where I was a princess, turn me into a beggar, send me back home as a beggar. Yeah.
Well, gotta feed her somehow. I mean... Can't even sell pottery without it getting trampled. Come on. I mean, that story does have a bit of a moral there, of course, because it's like, show some humility, I guess, is the moral.
Yeah, the moral is don't be too prideful and like give up all of your. Don't be too prideful. Don't antagonize people unnecessarily.
And learn sales, for crying out loud.
And learn sales and how to protect pottery from a horse soldier.
Yeah, or at least, pick your corners wisely.
Yeah.
Don't be married to the guy that's going to disguise himself and trample all your pottery. That might help too. Although it worked out in the end because he was a king, and so after her brief torment, he was like, "All right, we're cool now. You can be royalty again."
Yeah.
I'm sure that marriage went wonderfully after that.
I mean, I assume they all do.
Obviously. Some of the weirdness in these stories is what I really like, because I've never really looked into the history of Grimm's fairy tales. I don't know if were the Grimm brothers real people, or was it like someone writing under a pseudonym?
Yeah, they were real people.
Okay,
they were real people.
So the Grimm brothers, they did a wonderful job of leaving as much to the imagination as possible while still giving you details that were enjoyable and made for giving you more than a couple of sentences for stories that really could just be a couple sentences in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
They would just say things, and you were just expected to accept them, which was always hilarious. I think let's see, which Old Hildebrand, I think, was the story about the guy whose wife pretended to be sick so that he would run off on a mission to get her healthy, and the pastor that gave him the mission was actually going to hang out with his wife for the day and frolic and do all the adulterous things that adulterers do.
Right.
In that story, he meets an egg seller who's like, dude, she's cheating on you.
Yeah.
like he tells him the story of where he's going, and the guy's just like, she's cheating on you with the pastor that told you to do this. And then he just says, hop in my egg basket and I'll take you and show you. And he's like, okay. Yeah. And you just like picture a guy like jumping and shrinking down into this egg basket. Now, I don't know what egg basket means translated from the German fairy tale. I don't know if this is just something that's due to translation or if this guy was actually pulling a giant cart or something. I
assume it was like a large egg basket that was on his back.
Yeah, it's something like that. But I picture him like with a Little Red Riding Hood carrying her basket kind of thing, and the guy's just like, cool, I'll hide in here, just hops in. So like the physics of the world of Grimm's fairy tales are just all over the place, and people just don't remark on it at all, ever.
Well, so there are a couple of stories that I've read that end with someone flinging themselves up into the sky from a tree. And then the end of the story is just, and they never came down. The end.
It's a level of fantasticism that you don't really. There are times when it's appropriate to explain as much as you can for the sake of the reader understanding what's going on, and then there's times where it doesn't matter. And I think the Grimm brothers really knew when it just didn't matter. It's like, now that he's got to be hiding somewhere. He's in the egg basket, okay? That's where he's hiding. That's how they're going to do this. It's like we're not going to sit here and work out the intricacies of, okay, there's this hallway in the house and there was this little pillar he could stand behind and he snuck in through it. No, he's in the egg basket. Screw it.
He's just in the basket and they put the basket on the bench and he sits there until they all start singing and then he sings back. The end.
And that one ends so great because he's just like, I'm never going to enjoy singing again.
Yeah. Get out of my house, pastor. I'm never going to enjoy singing again.
Well, he didn't see that. This is what's great about Grimm's fairy tales. He didn't just tell him to get out of his house. He chased him out with a cudgel.
Well, it says in the version I have, it says drove the person out of the house. So
yeah. Okay. So let me see. I've still got it in front of me here. Let me look it up real quick. So that was Old Hildebrand. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yes. I just said the name a minute ago. So Old Hildebrand, where are you? Where be Old Hildebrand? Page 54. Going to page 54. I'm looking at the last words. I'm not actually doing that yet because I haven't gotten to the page yet. But
of course not.
Yeah, the last words of Old Hildebrand. It says, and he got out of the basket and cudgeled the parson out of the house. I feel like that's an excellent.
My version says drove instead of cudgeled. But yeah.
I like cudgeled as the translation a little better, which is one of the things that you'll notice about Grimm's fairy tales is you're probably never going to read each one the same way twice. So you could buy 5 different versions of a book of collections of Grimm's fairy tales and probably feel like you're reading different stories at times. And for the most part, they say the same things, but there's probably especially given the times that some of these were translated, a lot of liberties were probably taken. So what are they, like late 1800s?
It's worth noting... if not earlier, yeah. I mean, it's worth noting that these are children's stories, and so a lot of the word choice is very basic. A lot of 1 and 2 syllable words. I'm surprised that the word cudgeled got put into a translation because I don't imagine that would be a common word for children to understand. But I'm looking at this and I'm noticing that almost every word is 1 or 2 syllables, which is impressive for something in German. Little joke there, but.
And we're canceled by the Germans.
Yay! But yeah, the stories are written with children with the purpose of them being something that you would say read to children, and a lot of them end with some little like self-aware, fourth wall breaking statement. Quite a few of them end with like a little sentence like that as well. See if I can find an example, but Yeah, so at the end of King Thrushbeard, in the version that I have, the last sentence in the story is actually, "I cannot help wishing that you and I could have been there too." So, whatever.
I think that's the same way that my version ended. It
Yeah,
sounds familiar.
they're pretty similar, our two translations. So that's fine.
It's not too difficult to find the yeah, it says, "I wish you and I had been there too."
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stories seem to end with after having just been narrated. A lot of the stories end with the actual voice of, whichever brother it is that came up with it, saying something from a personal level like that. Like, you go through the whole story, and then it's just like he addresses you and himself and finishes up the tale. So, since we're canceled by the Germans, we may as well go ahead and talk about another one of the stories that you had me read, which is The Jew Among Thorns. And we're just going to bring this one up just for the purpose of getting canceled by the Jews as well, because...
Okay, sure. the twofer.
Yeah, I mean, now we've got... I mean, that's top tier right there. We're canceled by basically everyone we need to be canceled by if we can... get the Germans and the Jews canceling us. That's but anyway, to give you an idea of how that story went, it doesn't really matter too much how that story went. I just kind of want to point out, we could talk about it if you want, but I just want to point out the part where this guy does a kind deed. So a dwarf gives him 3 gifts, which are
wishes,
and he gets 3 gifts out of it. One being a bow,
a gun that never misses. A fiddle that causes people who hear it to dance.
Yeah,
and the ability and the ability to
for people to do any favor he asks. Yes,
basically.
So he meets what is described in the story as a Jew.
Yes.
and he what was he like shoots a bird for the Jew.
Yeah.
And
he shoots a bird for the guy.
Asks the Jew to go and fetch it. This is the funny part of the story where it's just like, while this guy is crawling through a bunch of thistles to get to this bird, he starts playing the fiddle. So this guy is jumping up and dancing and like cutting himself on all these thorns. And it's just like, oh yeah, this is a German story. Definitely a German story. There was no reason for it to happen. Like, up until that point in the story, this guy is incredibly kind. And then for no reason at all, this guy's crawling through these thorns to get to this bird. And he just makes him start dancing so that he cuts himself up. And it's like, wait a minute. What a dick.
Why would you do that? Yeah.
But then it turns out that the Jew is actually a dick as well. So in the end, they I don't want to say it's like reverse justice, because still, what a dick. But I mean,
well, so the story is weird because basically the Jew goes to say, hey, someone, this guy,
he slanders him.
Yeah, he slandered. Well,
sort of.
I mean, it's not even slander is too strong a word for it, because he basically just says this guy beat me up and took my stuff, which is not true.
But on the same token, he did kind of beat him up.
Well, like, he did it indirectly in like a magical way that makes it hard to like he didn't hit him with a fist. He caused him to dance in thistles, which is just like I'm not sure how
that makes it better.
No, it doesn't make it better.
Like, there's nothing in the story to indicate that this was accidental. He totally did that on purpose.
It just makes it harder to establish an evidentiary basis.
Yeah.
and so they're basically going to execute the guy who has the fiddle and the gun and all that stuff. And the guy with the fiddle is like, well, can I just play the fiddle one last time before you kill me? And they're like, yeah, sure. And so he plays the fiddle and everyone dances. And because everyone dances, they're like, oh, this Jew must have lied about something, and now the Jew's the bad guy, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
It's even worse and weirder than that, because he asks to play the fiddle one more time, and everyone, and he prefaces this by saying, if he didn't like my music, then obviously he wouldn't dance, right? But the weird thing is, everyone in that scene is compelled to dance, which should set off alarm bells in their head. Like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
No, I mean that's.
It's a strange story.
It's a very strange story, and it's I feel like it's in some ways more than others. It might have been a very German story at the time. And now that we are thoroughly canceled, let's move on to another story.
Sure, why not? How about Clever Gretel?
Clever Gretel. This one takes the cake for me. This one was okay. So imagine, if you will, you have this wonderful worker, just does everything right for you. Absolutely superb. You could trust her with everything. Why did she do all of this stuff? It's just so funny. So she makes all these excuses. They're going to have a feast. And the story starts out with this scene that kind of just establishes how Gretel thinks, which is like, oh, well, there's this thing that I drank, and I can't leave the other one empty. It would be on... It's like an OCD story, almost.
Yeah.
Where she drinks half a bottle of something, then she's like, well, the half a bottle doesn't look right sitting there, so I may as well drink the whole bottle. But they're going to make this feast, and the master of the house is going to invite a friend over. Gretel's preparing the food, but it's taking a bit of time, and so this guy goes out to find his friend. He's going to come back, and the feast should be ready when he gets back. Well, while they're gone, Gretel starts thinking to herself, well, they're taking a while, and maybe they're not coming back, and if they're not coming back, then, well, no, first she wants to taste test the food, right? So she takes a wing off of one of the chickens.
Yes.
And then she looks at it and says, well, if I take one, I may as well take the other one. And so she eats a second wing off the chicken. Well, now she's got to eat the whole thing, obviously. I mean, that's just what you do, right? And so she eats the whole chicken, and there's still one good chicken left, but...
In the version that I have, it does say that she, continues to wait. And, in general, there's some complaint in there about, man, these things are ready. If we can't overcook them and we can't let them get cold either. So, this thing's not going to be very good if I just leave it as it is. So maybe I should just eat it, kind of thing. There's an air of that in the version that I have.
Yeah, it's in my version too. There's this kind of sense that time is passing, and she's looking at this chicken, almost salivating, like, well, I mean, they might not even be coming back for all I know. I may as well eat them. You can't just let them go to waste. So right. She slowly devours both chickens over the course of this time period, and then the master, it wasn't the master that returned first.
It was. The master comes back and says, "The guest is coming."
Oh yeah, that's it. Okay, so she runs out of the house, finds the guest, and gives him these tasks. She tells him that her master is planning on killing him.
Right.
So she tricks him.
Well, so in my version, it says cut off your ears.
Yeah, cut off your ears. It's not murder. So
because he's basically sharpening his knife on a piece of stone.
Yeah.
Waiting for the guest to show up, and she goes to the guest and is like, "He's going to cut your ears off. You should go. You should.
You should
now.
Really go now."
And so the guest runs off. And
wasn't he carrying something though? Like she gave him something?
No. She claims that he took the fowl.
That was it. Okay,
right. So she's like, yeah, the guest came and he just came in, he grabbed the birds and he ran off. And the master's like,
oh no, that was it. That was it.
That's strange.
The important part of the story was that she goes back to the master and tells him that he ran off with the chickens, and he is like, well, didn't he leave at least one for us so that we could have something? And she's like, no, he took them both. And so he runs out the door with the knife. His intention is to shout after him, saying to leave them one chicken so that they have something to eat. But all that guy sees, after being told that this guy wants to cut off his ears, is a guy running out of his door holding a knife and shouting just one while running after him. So he just books it. And Clever Gretel is off the hook.
Basically, and well fed as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I like Clever Gretel. She's like the Sanjuro of Grimm's fairy tales. I picture her sitting down after that and just like folding her hands over what I'm sure is a nice portly belly and just being like, it's good to be the king. So what else did we read, or what else do we have to say?
So
about
we have two stories in a row that are incredibly violent. We have Fitcher's Bird and the Robber Bridegroom.
Yeah, they were.
Fitcher's Bird is weird.
That's another one where someone climbs into a basket. Like this is a story about a wizard who goes around town pretending to be a beggar, and then kidnapping young girls.
Yes.
And he takes this girl back to his place. There's these three daughters.
There's a guy with three daughters, and he takes the eldest daughter and basically takes her home and says, "Here, hold this egg and don't let go of it. And here's a key to a door that you're not allowed to open." And so she basically, and he's like, "Now I'm going to go away and you clean the house and get things ready for when I come back." And she's like, "Okay, fine." So she cleans the house and she goes to that door and she's like, "Well, there's I just gotta check and see what's in this door. So she puts the key into the lock, and opens the door. And inside, she sees this charnel house of people that the wizard has killed and chopped up. And she freaks out, and she gets blood on herself and on the egg. And she can't, and for some reason, the eggshell stains permanently, and so she cleans her clothes off, but she can't clean the egg. The wizard comes back, sees that there's blood spots on the egg, and says, "Oh, you went inside the door," and then he chops her up and leaves her in that room. He then repeats the same thing with the second daughter. There's no difference in the story with the second daughter. Finally, the third daughter shows up, and the third daughter, she breaks the rules immediately. She sets the egg down somewhere, and then she opens the door, and that way she avoids getting blood on the egg.
Yeah, so Wizard Boy, who is now
Wizard Boy comes back. He's like, "Oh, there's no blood on the egg. You didn't look inside the door." But it's worse than that. To borrow a phrase from some of our old stuff, because what happens is that she goes in and she sees this charnel house, and she recognizes the dismembered bodies of her sisters, puts them together, and they reformulate into living people.
Yeah, no, this story had the best imagery.
She makes them run away. It's bizarre.
The story had the best imagery out of all the stories, because like when he first kidnaps the first daughter, it talks about how she came to the door to give him some bread, and he reaches out and touches her, and it compels her to jump in his basket, and he carries her off. Now again, with the whole incredible shrinking woman diving into the basket thing, I can't imagine it any other way. I really don't know what the translation is there. I really don't know if there is anything wrong in the translation that makes it seem so silly. But when you take into account that there's this imagery of this girl going into a dismemberment chamber and restructuring both of her sisters and them coming back to life, I can kind of see where there's probably not anything lost in translation. It's just like, oh, in the basket, there you go.
Yeah. Well, so the ending of the story is very strange because there's two parts to the ending, and they don't seem to really be connected to each other in any significant way. But basically, she gets her sisters back to life. She puts them in a basket and then covers them with gold and says to the wizard, "Take this gold to my parents as like a what's the opposite of a dowry? Like a payment to my parents for me being your wife, basically."
Bribery?
And he's like, "Okay," and he's like, "No, there's a special word for it, but ignore that." Basically, she's like, "I'm going to be looking at you through the window, and you don't stop. You walk all the way there without stopping." And he's like, "Okay, fine." And so he's walking, and he stops, and basically her sisters say, whenever he stops, her sisters say, "Hey, I can see you from this window. You better keep going." And he's like, "Oh, she can still see me? I guess I better keep walking." So he walks, and he delivers the two reconstituted daughters back to their parents, and then he comes back, but then she basically covers herself in honey and feathers, and then runs away, and is called Fitcher's bird for some reason, and then there's like a bridegroom that comes, and he thought the skull was his bride. She put a skull in the window, and he greets the skull.
That's that's the wizard. When he returns, he thinks the skull in the window is her.
Right, but she's gone, and she basically tells everybody, "Hey, this guy's a wizard, and he's killing people." And so the villagers all come and lock the doors of the house and set fire to the house. So the wizard and all his crew, we see no other characters in this story, were burned.
It is a fantastic story. Just the imagery, the hilarity of the wizard who, at the very moment that
well, so the funny thing about it to me is that she puts her two sisters together, but there's a lot of other dead people in there that she could have put together but didn't.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously it gets a bit hard to sort the parts out if you don't recognize them, I guess.
I guess, yeah.
It's just funny that, especially when it gets to the point where she's just like, "You better keep going, I'll be watching you from the window." At that point, the wizard should have been like, wait a minute, I'm the wizard here. Why am I listening to her?
Well, so in my version, there's like a thing that says, now he had no longer any power over her and was forced to do whatsoever she desired.
Yeah, there was no reason for it either. It just said that. You're just supposed to accept that.
It's because she passed the test by failing the test.
Yeah. Yeah, so I very circumstantial something magic there or something. I don't. It's another one of them things where he takes an oath that he self-enforces.
Right. And I guess he's a wizard, so maybe he can do that, but I don't know why he would do that.
Yeah, the bird thing, though, was the most confusing. It's like, because she does meet him coming back, and he doesn't recognize her while she's in disguise, so you can kind of see it as a ruse to get past him so she can make her escape.
Sure.
But it really seems weird that she absolutely had to run into him to escape. Like these stories are written in a way where it's like there's two paths between there's one path between her house and the wizard's place, and there's no other way that she could possibly go. So obviously you have to cover yourself in honey and feathers and then just pretend you're a giant bird to everyone you meet. Who zero alarm bells. I mean, I guess if you're living in a world where people will dive headfirst into baskets and disappear, I wouldn't be surprised at giant bird people walking around. So I guess it kind of makes sense. And by the way, we really need to figure out what was happening in historic Germany at the time that they had this basket transportation technology that we have somehow lost throughout the centuries.
Right.
Because it sounds really convenient, to be honest.
I mean, it's extremely convenient. The other thing is that there is no other mention of anyone named Fitcher.
No, there's not.
So, like, it's just, "Oh, Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here? I came from Fitcher's house, quite near." I guess Fitcher is the wizard? That's the only...
But no, the wizard also calls her Fitcher's bird, and she says something about coming from Fitcher's house, and this doesn't mean anything to the wizard, so I don't know if the wizard is actually Fitcher.
I guess not. That's actually a good point, yeah. But everyone recognizes her as Fitcher's bird, because the way that this thing is set up is as a set of quotes. "Oh, Fitcher's bird, how comest thou here? I come from Fitcher's house, quite near. And what may the young bride be doing? From cellar to garret, she swept all clean, and now from the window she's peeping, I ween," is the version that I have.
It's about the same in mine.
Yeah. So like they basically, these wedding guests who are friends of the wizard are on their way to the wizard's house for the wedding feast, and they see they see a person covered in honey and feathers and say, "Oh, you're Fitcher's bird. Why are you here?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm coming from Fitcher's place, totally."
A year later, someone just knocks at their door. She opens it up, and there's just this giant bird dude standing there, like, "What the hey?"
Yeah.
What was that all about? Now, there's the amount of whimsy in these stories is something I absolutely love. It's even when it has to do with something as gruesome, like, there's always people that like to do these really, really dark interpretations of what is essentially already a dark story, but you could totally see that that story alone, just Fitcher's bird, you could see that being an entire movie, start to finish, that's just got really, really dark undertones of this wizard kidnapping these girls, and one would hope that if they actually made a movie like that, they would have people diving into the basket just for the imagery.
Yes, that would be nice.
Although I don't think it could do justice to what's in my head when I read those lines. But no, they're just... It's fantastic how both whimsical and dark these stories get, and it makes them really fun to read. It's just like... And you can have a collection of these and just pick them up off your nightstand and open it to a random page and get like 5 minutes of enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, a lot of people try to make dark versions of fairy tales, and, like, what they always end up making these fairy tales that kind of sort of make sense. And there's something so much darker about all the senseless violence in actual Grimm's fairy tales than, like, any story that makes sense that someone put together. There's something to it, you know?
Yeah, like the next story that we'll talk about, The Robber Bridegroom.
Oh, sure. The Robber Bridegroom.
In which a woman is promised to a man, and she has a sense that something is off about him, but eventually he talks her into going to visit his house. And for some reason, he leaves a trail of ash between her house and his house, which that's 2 days' work, probably. I mean,
she doesn't she like grab a bag of peas and throw peas around as she goes on the path?
Yeah, because nobody has a sense of direction in these stories, so she has to leave herself a trail to get back, because the ash is going to blow away by the end of the story.
Is that what she says?
I think that's what happened.
Sense of that.
Did it not say that? Maybe it didn't. Maybe I'm thinking of the breadcrumbs.
No, she just throws the peas, and the peas never do anything.
No, they do. They do. They sprout.
Lentils.
They sprout at the end of the story. It talks about them sprouting, and she follows them back.
Really?
So I don't know if the ash is blown away, or if she just forgot where the ash was going and was like, "Oh, well, good thing these sprouts are here. I don't know what all this ash is laying around for, but." It's
the wind had carried away the ashes from the path, but the peas and lentils had budded and sprung up, and the moonshine upon them showed the way.
Yeah, which I mean, again, just run with it.
Which
Don't.
This all happens in like the course of one day, so I don't know exactly how that works. But basically, she goes to this house and she's like, something's funky here. I don't like this. And she finds an old woman in the basement, and the old woman's like, "Hey, they're gonna eat you." What? And she's like, "What?" And the old woman's like, "They're gonna eat you. Hide behind this jar." And she's like, "Okay, I'm gonna hide behind a jar." And so they come back and they bring another woman, and then they kill her and eat her. So they're not just robbers; they're cannibals. and and she's like, "Oh, this is bad." And then they basically, in the process of chopping up this first woman, they throw a finger behind this cask that the girl is hiding behind, and the finger has a ring on it, and and so the girl basically comes up with a way to get herself and the old woman out by knocking out all the robbers. The old woman puts something in their soup to knock the robbers out for a long time. They all get out of there. Then they run away. They use the peas and lentils that had budded and sprung up to guide them home, because of course you need peas and lentils sprouting to guide you home.
It's
And
better
then on
than
the
GPS.
wedding day, yeah, right. And on the wedding day, basically they all get in a circle and tell stories, and she's like, "Oh, I'm not going to tell a story."
Well, hang on. I will
Yeah.
read that part because it's worth a read.
Okay, go. Yeah.
Just for the repetitiveness of it. Let's see. Where does the dream start? When the day came when the wedding was to be celebrated, the bridegroom appeared, and the miller had invited all his relations and friends. As they sat at a table, each was bidden to relate something. The bride sat still and said nothing. Then the bridegroom to the bride, "Come, my darling, dost thou know nothing? Relate something to us like the rest." She replied, "Then I will relate a dream. I was walking alone through a wood, and at last I came to a house in which no living soul was, but on the wall there was a bird in a cage which cried, 'Turn back, young maiden dear, 'tis a murderer's house you enter here.' And this it cried once more. My darling, I only dreamt this. Then I went through all the rooms, and they were all empty, and there was something so horrible about them. At last I went down into the cellar, and there sat a very, very old woman, whose head shook. I asked her, 'Does my bridegroom live in this house?' She answered, 'Alas, poor child, thou hast got into a murderer's den. Thy bridegroom does live here, but he will hew thee in pieces and kill thee, and then he will cook thee and eat thee.' My darling, I only dreamt this. But the old woman hid me behind a great hogshead, and scarcely was I hidden when the robbers came home, dragging a maiden with them, to whom they gave 3 kinds of wine to drink, white, red, and yellow, with which her heart broke in twain. My darling, I only dreamt this. Thereupon they pulled off her pretty clothes and hewed her fair body in pieces on a table, and sprinkled them with salt. My darling, I only dreamt this. And one of the robbers saw that there was still a ring on her little finger, and it was hard to draw off. He took an axe to cut it off, but the finger sprang up in the air and sprang behind the great hogshead and fell into my bosom. And here is the finger with the ring." And with these words she drew it forth and showed it to those present. The robber, who had during the story become as pale as ashes, leapt up and wanted to escape, but the guests held him fast and delivered him over to justice. Then he and his whole troop were executed for their infamous deeds. Now, just the way that the Grimm brothers like to repeat things as they're telling a story is one of the things that most other authors will avoid, and yet it gives it gives the tone for like 60% of Grimm's fairy tales.
Well, so the important part right here is that basically she's telling the story, and the bridegroom is like doing the hand across the neck thing, like, "No, stop, stop, you're going too far." And she's like, "No, I'm not done yet. There's still more to my dream." Blah 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 blah. He's like, "No, stop. It's a very strange and funny ending to a very gruesome story.
Yeah,
because even the wizard didn't eat his victims. He just chopped them up for no reason.
Yeah, they went into a little more detail about them cutting this woman up and eating her than...
Yeah, so your version is a little bit more graphic than my version, honestly. There's nothing there about the 3 wines breaking her heart, and they just say, "And then they killed her and cut her in pieces." But yeah, it's a they told this to children, and
and rightfully so.
I'm not sure for what reason they did so.
Well, I mean, obviously you want to convince children not to drink red or white or yellow wine. So I don't know what constitutes yellow wine, but
I've never seen that one before.
But obviously that was the moral of the story. Don't drink, children. You'll be eaten.
Don't mix your drinks, kids.
Your heart will break in twain. And the kids are like, "What's twain? I don't know. I'm German."
And then he spoke a word that was like 17 syllables long, and the end.
Yeah, so the robber bridegroom is probably the most graphic of the ones that we read. But then there is the occasional. Yes. I guess the singing bone is a pretty straightforward story about, what the moral is. I guess I don't know.
Is don't kill your brother.
Yeah. Well, also don't lie about murder.
Personal gain.
Don't commit murder.
Don't lie
really.
about it if you do. Don't commit murder, and if you do, don't lie about it, because it's going to come back and get you.
Because bones will sing. The dead men will tell tales.
Right.
Oh, so this is a story where, once again, almost everything about this story is normal. There's a wild boar that's killing people, and the king wants it to stop. And so he offers his daughter's hand in marriage to anyone that can stop this wild boar. These two brothers decide to go after it. One of them is a vicious old jerk, and another one is innocent and naive and hopeful. So they enter the forest, each from separate sides, on the advice of the king who gave them the mission. And the older brother takes his time, knowing that the monster isn't going to disappear anytime soon. The boar will still be there when he enters the wood. But during that time, his younger brother immediately sets off into the woods and runs into someone completely at random who's just like, "Oh, here you go, have a spear that'll kill just about anything." So very fortuitous. So
yes.
So that's the first thing that makes it a little bit out of the ordinary from just your average everyday story of someone hunting a boar. He kills this boar, and he's dragging it back and runs into his brother, who's having a party, while he's waiting. He's going to basically be the tortoise to the brother's hair.
So in the version that I have, the king advises them to enter from different directions, but also to enter at different times. He tells the younger to enter in the morning and the elder to go in the evening. So in my version, the elder brother is basically making merry and kind of drinking himself into a bit of confidence to take on this wild boar. And then the younger brother comes by. He's like, "Here, I found someone gave me this spear and I killed the boar, and here I am.
Got the boar.
I got it. I did it."
And so the older brother, naturally, decides to lead his brother to a bridge, kill him, toss his body over the bridge, and take the boar to the king and be like, "Hey, I got the boar."
Yeah.
So that works out for a few years, but at some point, someone's wandering along this bridge and sees this bone sticking out. And as you do with bones that are unidentified, you assume that they're not human, and you carve them up into a flute. And then you try to play the flute, and the bone sings to you the nature of the crime, but it isn't apparent to the person who hears it. It would only be apparent to, say, the king.
And so the shepherd goes to the king and plays the flute again.
He specifically brings it to the king because it's like, "Oh, the king will like this." Yes. He has no idea the portent of what he's hearing. So he plays it. The king hears what happens, immediately knows what it means. And did he put the brother to death? He puts him to death.
In my version, he was therefore ordered to be tied in a sack and drowned.
Oh, yeah.
While the remains of his murdered brother were carefully carried to the churchyard and laid to rest in a beautiful grave.
Yeah, pretty much the same thing that happened in mine, except they sewed him up in a sack and threw him in the river to drown.
That's what I just said.
It was worded differently.
Tied in a sack and drowned.
Yeah, sewed up and tied, two different things. I like the idea of them taking the time to sew him up while he's like, "Don't do this, please don't kill me." It's like, hang on, I need to thread this needle. They're like elbowing him every once in a while.
The only way it could be worse is if they had to knit him into a sack and drown him. One knit, two purl, one knit. Stop.
But yeah, the second thing, of course, would be the singing bone, which, if only our system of justice was as simple as singing bones, it would make things so much easier.
Well, I mean, this is one of those things where, I mean, this is a common theme, actually, in literature, right? The idea that dead men tell no tales, that the crime can be figured out, later on, and that the arm of justice may be long and slow, but it does make its way around eventually, right? I mean, like, basically the lesson we're teaching kids here is if you do a bad thing, it's going to come back and bite you in the ass eventually. But the idea that, like, dead men tell no tales is I mean, Dead Men Tell No Tales is from a piece of literature, right? I forget.
Treasure Island, I think.
Or is it? Yeah, I think so. But, like, that same phrase appears in all kinds of books. Like, one that, is dear to my heart is The Silent Speaker by Rex Stout. a Nero Wolfe story, where the whole story hinges on the fact that a guy recorded, a statement about one other guy that would convict him of murder, and the whole story revolves around this stenophone cylinder that they need to find in order to get the evidence to find the murderer, basically. And one of the points in that story is, dead men tell no tales. Our literature needs revision.
Yeah, and it's also the only mystery story that I am aware of where a central item is a wax cylinder.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a fantastic read. So anyone that needs a good book to read, The Silent Speaker by Rex Stout.
Yes.
I do love Grimm's fairy tales, but given the choice between a dozen Grimm's fairy tales or The Silent Speaker, I'd probably take The Silent Speaker.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's definitely a more cohesive story.
Well, I mean, cohesion is not exactly what Grimm's is known for, which brings us to The Skillful Huntsman.
No. Yes.
This story is all over the place. It opens with the Grimm brothers talking about this young man who is an apprentice to a locksmith. And he's like,
yes.
Hey, I'm getting pretty good at this locksmith thing, so I'm going to head out and go find my place in the world. And his dad's just like, okay, cool, and gives him some money. He takes off and immediately decides locksmithing is not for him. So he meets a huntsman. like the locksmithing thing has nothing to do with the rest of the story.
But the funny thing is that he's like, oh, I'm good with it. This is something I'm good at. And then he's like, oh, I'm done with it.
Yeah, there's... And don't go thinking something crazy like this is going to play into the moral of the story. This isn't one of them things where it's like, and he just was fickle his whole life and never... No, not at all. It just doesn't matter. So now he's going to be a huntsman. He lives with this huntsman for a year and becomes pretty proficient, but that doesn't matter either because the huntsman basically gives him a gun that never misses. And so he meets these giants and shoots food out of their hands for no reason that I was able to discern, other than he felt like shooting food out of the hands of giants. So the giants threaten him and say, we could use your help, but if you don't come work for us, we'll kill you. And so he comes out of the brush and is like, okay, what do you need me to do? They're like, we need you to shoot a dog. so they base...
Thus was born the ATF.
Yes. Yes, it used to stand for a tall figure.
Yes.
There's this princess in a tower, as there is, that these giants want to get a hold of for reasons. And there's a dog that always barks and wakes up the entire kingdom, which, personally, if I lived in that kingdom, I think someone would have shot that dog already by that point. But nobody can get near this princess without this dog barking.
Yeah.
So this huntsman shows up, and the dog comes running out, and he shoots the dog. Again, made for the ATF, this guy. The only difference is... we have to charitably assume that he would have to be using the magic gun because we all know how accurate the ATF is, and it's not very.
I mean, if you have a magic gun, you can actually hit things as a member of the ATF.
Yeah,
so there you go.
Maybe. Like, I wonder if they're so bad that the even the magic gun has a bit of a
little bit of leeway in it. Yeah, maybe.
But anyway.
Well, so he shoots the dog, and then he's like, I should go in and check things out, before I just leave. And so he finds some stuff that has the king's name on it, including a sword, and basically takes it. And then he's like, I'll take the pair of slippers, and I'll take a pair of scissors and cut off the corner of her neckerchief, and I'll also cut a little bit of her nightdress off, and he takes these 3 items.
Yeah, he takes cuttings of some cloth and a slipper, and he's just there like, a little memento here, a little memento here, and this is all happening this is all happening in the room of a princess who is asleep at the time. So there's basically this invader in her room that's just cutting pieces of cloth and taking them for himself. Yes. And then he decides he doesn't want these giants to actually take this princess. It's like, oh no, she doesn't deserve that. I mean, they'll probably do awful things to her. So he then lures these giants to a tunnel that he tells them they would have to crawl in to effect their ingress into these grounds to steal this princess away. And as each one is crawling through the tunnel, he takes a magic sword, which he found on the wall of this tower that this princess is in.
It's the sword that has the king's name on it.
Yeah, and it's just a magic sword that will kill anything that he strikes with it. So why someone would leave that hanging on a wall, I don't know. whatever. So
in a princess's room.
Yeah, so as each giant comes through this tunnel, he lops off their head and drags their body through to give the impression to the next giant that this giant is still crawling through. And after he kills all 3 giants in this manner, he cuts out their tongues because, memento, gotta have another memento.
Because why not?
Now the weirdest part about that is after all of this happens, this guy just vanishes, and the king comes out.
Yeah, he just goes away. He's like, I'm gonna go explore the world.
He's out of the story for a while. So the king comes out wandering the grounds, and he's like, "Oh, there's 3 dead giants near the tower near the princess. Wonder what's going on with that."
Strange, but okay.
And
yeah,
obviously someone protected the princess from these giants and did not take any credit for it. Well, we got to figure out who this person is. So he asks around, and one of his captains is like, "Oh yeah, that's me, totally." And
totally, that was me. Yeah.
And so the princess is
quote, "who was one-eyed and a hideous man."
So he tells the princess that she has to marry this captain, and she's like, "I will run away before I marry this guy." Yeah. And so obviously what happens next is the king becomes angry and forces her to live on the street selling pottery, which he then has people run around and crush up underfoot. I don't know why this is a thing in Germany. But I think this was the last story I read. And the first...
he makes her cook food for people for free forever.
Yeah, he puts her in a hut after that and is like, "You live here now. You cook food for anyone that wants food, and you don't get to take money for it. Blah." And he slams the door and walks out. And so eventually this huntsman returns, finds this cabin, sees that it's offering free food, is like, "Oh, I like free food.
Free food, hell yeah."
So he goes inside, and she's making him some food, and during the course of them conversing, he starts pulling out all this stuff, and he's like, "Oh yeah, so I have this slipper and these pieces of cloth and this sword."
Okay, so he pulls out the sword
and these 3 tongues.
He pulls out the sword, and she's like, "Hey, that has my father's name on it." And he's like, "Are you the king's daughter?" And she's like, "Yeah, I'm the king's daughter." And he's like, "Here, look at all these mementos that I have."
He still has the 3 tongues. Why has he been carrying the 3
tongues,
giant tongues around? They can't possibly
the corner
be fresh
of the neckerchief,
anymore.
the slipper. Yeah. And so basically she's like, "Hey, look, it wasn't the one-eyed horrible man that killed the giants. It was this guy." And the king's like, "Oh, you brought proof. I should have asked for that in the first place."
Yeah, they don't actually. It kind of just jumps from, "Oh, that's my father's sword," to her.
Well, okay. So there's one thing I want to highlight is that the captain, who the one-eyed hideous man captain, who's like trying to claim credit, he's like. The king notices that the giants don't have any tongues, and he's like, "Where would?" He's like, "Yeah, but what happened to the giants' tongues?" And the captain is like, "They never had tongues."
In the most politician response possible, he's like, "Well, giant. I mean, if they didn't have tongues when you found them, giants probably don't have tongues. I mean, how would we know?" And the king's just like, "Every living thing has tongues," but then he just runs with it. He's like, "All right. So if someone were to have lied about, having killed these giants."
Well, like the king asks these leading questions of the captain. He's like, "Well, let's say hypothetically that someone did do all of these horrible things that I have not so subtly implied that you did. What should be his punishment?" And the captain guy is like,
showing remarkable wit.
Showing
remarkable wit.
He says, quote, "He ought to be torn in pieces." And then the king's like, "Cool, that's your sentence." And then they tear him up.
It's absolutely wonderful. It's like, how dumb do you have to be? It's like, I mean, if you figured out who the criminal was in that case, I would say shower him with a few gold pieces and tell him to leave your kingdom. That would be a suitable punishment, definitely. And then I'd give a big thumbs up.
It's funny because this story came right after The Goose Girl, which is another story that ends with the same like trick. So
did it? Well, wait, did anyone get punished in that story? I don't think anyone got punished in that story.
Oh yeah, the false bride got punished in The Goose Girl.
Are you thinking of Maid Maleen?
Okay.
You're thinking of Maid Maleen.
No.
Maid Maleen was the one with the hideous woman telling the maid to take her place.
No, the Goose Girl.
No, the Goose Girl was the one about the old woman that made the guy carry the stuff back to his place, and there was the ugly girl there who was the Goose Girl.
No, but the point is that there's the false bride in The Goose Girl, And at the end of the Goose Girl, the false bride said she deserves no better fate than to be stripped naked and put into a barrel which is studded inside with pointed nails, and then harness 2 white horses to it, dragging her through the street one after another until she is dead. That's the point of the Goose Girl that I'm talking about.
That didn't happen in the Goose Girl.
Yes, it is. I'm looking at it right now.
That happened in son of a gun. Who was the false bride? Because there was a false bride in Maid Maleen.
There was a false bride in Maid Maleen too, but she just got her head cut off.
My version of the Goose Girl didn't have a false bride at all, so yeah, I've got a very different version. Okay, then yeah, we're
So in my version of the Goose Girl, there's an old queen whose husband had been dead for many years, and she had a beautiful daughter. She betroths her princess to this prince, and she basically gives everything that she has to the princess and sends her off to the prince with a maid. And the maid takes all of the princess's stuff and basically forces the princess to swear on the sky that she won't tell anybody that she's been swindled by this maid. And basically the maid, the princess now, who looks like a maid, gets married off to this guy named Conrad. For some reason, there's a thing there. And there's also a talking horse. And and so the false bride, the false princess, tells a guy to cut the head off the horse and kill it. But then also the true bride tells him to mount the head of the dead talking horse at the top of a gate that she passes through every day. And then the horse's corpse head answers whenever she says, "Alas Falada," hanging there. And she passes under. And basically, through a series of weird coincidences, they figure out that the person who actually has been quote unquote married to the prince is not the right person. And the king is like, let me just read the end of the Goose Girl in my version. At the head of the table sat the bridegroom with the king's daughter on one side of him, and the waiting maid on the other. But the waiting maid was blinded and did not recognize the princess in her dazzling array. When they had eaten and drunk and were merry, the aged king asked the waiting maid as a riddle what a person deserved who had behaved in such and such a way to her master, and at the same time related the whole story and asked what such a one merited. Then the false bride said, she deserves no better fate than to be stripped entirely naked and put into a barrel, which is studded inside with pointed nails, and 2 white horses should be harnessed to it, which will drag her along through one street after another till she is dead. It is you, said the aged king, and you have pronounced your own sentence, and thus shall it be done unto you. When the sentence had been carried out, the young king married his true bride, and both of them reigned over their kingdom in peace and happiness.
Okay, I don't know what I read, because I read a story that was referring to someone as a goose girl. I didn't read that story. That is the last story in the book I have. And for the life of me, I cannot find the story that I actually read. And it's driving me crazy here because she's called the Goose Girl in the story. And I don't know what I read.
No, well, we read Maid Maleen too, which has a false bride in it as well.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was confused, because the story I read was about this old woman is described as someone who is really, like, hardworking and doing all this work that everyone looks at and is like, she's too old to be doing that, and yet she does it. And so this guy shows up, this count, and he offers to help her at one point, and she's kind of mocking him, saying that he couldn't do this hard work. And so she loads him up with a bunch of crap on his back. It's like, all right, carry this to my house. And it's just, it is just a slog. And at one point she jumps on his back, and he's just like, okay, fine, we're here. And they get there, and she's like, okay, I'm going to reward you for this. While he's there, he meets this girl that is referred to in the story as a goose girl. And she's very ugly. And he kind of just doesn't want to look her way. And the old woman comes back and hands him this book that's made out of an emerald somehow. And sends him a packet and is like, thanks for the help. Here you go. Here's your reward. So he takes off. He goes and visits this kingdom and is introduced to the king and queen. And he offers the book to the queen, who reads it and immediately dies. And so they're going to kill this guy. But then she immediately also comes back to life and says, don't kill him, and has everyone leave the room and tells him about how they had 3 daughters. And the king had once asked them how much they love him. And 2 of them gave him straightforward answers. And the last one was like, well, it's difficult to say. I would say I love food, but I think what makes the food taste good is salt. So you're the salt. And the king takes offense at this and drives her from the kingdom and splits his kingdom between the other two daughters.
Yeah.
So this girl,
yeah,
she ends up being the ugly girl that is with the old woman. And when they realize this, because that book that he showed the queen, it was something of hers. The queen and the king are both like, we were too harsh on her. We should go find her. And so they spend some time trying to find this girl again. And they eventually find her, and he sees her taking off her mask by some well or something. And so he's like, oh, she's actually beautiful. Well, now I'll marry her. And so they find her. It's a happy ending. Everyone's happy, yada, yada. It turns out that the old woman is actually some kind of good witch. And she takes off, and suddenly the little house they've been living in turns into a palace. And so now this girl and this guy are now like the kings of this new land, and everything's
okay, so you're
changed.
talking about the goose girl at the well, which is a different story.
Yeah, that's the
apparently.
one I read, because the goose girl is the very last story in the book I have. And so as I was scanning through here, I'm like, there's no story just called the goose girl. This must be the one he means. So that's how that happened.
Well, so the one that I have has the goose girl story, which does have a lot of similarities with Maid Maleen, which comes right before it in the book. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think Maid Maleen is the last one we have to talk about, isn't it? Well, no,
yeah,
we didn't do Fair Catronelge or Catronelli or
Fair Catronelge and Piff
Poultry?
Paff Poultry is like another 2-paragraph story that basically is like, get permission before you do things.
Yeah. Piff Paff Poultry goes around to about 20 different people. He's like, I want to marry this person. Can I? He's like, well, ask this person. We'll ask this person. We'll ask this person. And then finally he asks everyone. It's like, okay, cool. So we good? And it's like, yeah, we're good.
So they get married. Yeah. And then there's a dowry. And then he's like, and then the princess is like, I have a dowry that is 14 farthings, 3.5 groschen, half a pound of dried apples, a handful of fried bread, and a handful of spices. And then she asks him, hey, what's your trade? And she's like, are you a tailor? He's like, something better. A shoemaker? Something better. A husbandman? Something better. A joiner? Something better. A smith? Something better. A miller? Something better. A broom maker? Yes, that's what I am. And that isn't that not a fine trade? And it's like, okay, fine, whatever. Oh, well, so we didn't talk about the old beggar woman either, which is another 1-paragraph story, where basically an old woman walks into a room where there's a fire, and she catches on fire, and a boy can't find a water to put her out, and then it ends with a fourth wall breaking things. He's like, he should have just cried on her. The end. So now we've got to go back to
Maid Maleen.
Maid Maleen.
So Maid Maleen is another story where someone didn't want to marry someone, and so the king locks her up in a tower with one of her handmaids or whatever it was, maidservant.
For 7 years. Yeah. And they fill this tower with food, and they basically like, all right, you got 7 years worth of food. Good luck.
And I just love how that happens. It's just like, you're getting locked up in the tower, and you know what? Screw you too, maidservant. You're going in there with her. It's like, what did I do? It's going to be basically dark. You'll have food. Deal with it. So time goes by, and they're eventually thinking to themselves, boy, I'm pretty sure it's been 7 years because we're running out of food. And it only just now occurs to them, okay, we need to maybe like try to dig out of here. Like I would have been carving at that wall the first day, but I guess if you're a princess of a kingdom, you're kind of just taking things in your stride. Like, they're not really going to keep us locked up here for 7 years, are you? And then like the maidservant pulls out a copy of Grimm's Fairy Tales. Yeah, they are. They're totally going to keep us locked up in here for 7 years. So that they start carving away at some of the brick, and they eventually get a little hole carved out, and they take a look out, and the kingdom is just demolished. Nobody's there. It's just like, we're for some reason, this tower was left standing. Nothing else was. I don't know why. Doesn't matter. But they're like, all right, well, we need to get out. So they carve themselves a hole, and eventually they're able to crawl out. It's interesting that they didn't think of this 7 years previous, when it seems to have only taken them a couple of days once they, committed to it, but what can you say, princesses? I mean, as a princess,
welcome to Grimm's Fairy Tales.
Yeah, as a princess, you think her first thought would have been, hey maidservant, take this spoon, get to work. We're getting out of here.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit that happens after that is not fresh in my memory. What happened immediately following
She
that?
basically travels across the countryside looking for a new place to be, and they like have to eat like nettle plants and stuff like that. And there's stuff about that, and she basically stumbles into a kingdom, and the son of the king in whose kingdom they were was, however, the very man who had been betrothed to Maid Maleen. His father had chosen another bride for him whose face was as ugly as her heart was wicked. The wedding was fixed, and the maiden had already arrived. Because of her great ugliness, however, she shut herself up in her room and allowed no one to see her. So basically, the evil, ugly woman tells Maid Maleen to pose as the bride and go get married with this prince, and then we'll pretend that I got married to him. And
she's
like,
too ashamed to walk the
why
streets.
Not?
Because of how ugly
right.
she is. So she has her stand in.
Yeah, and so basically the bride is like, okay, cool, I guess I'll walk down the aisle with this dude. And as she walks down the aisle, she like says 3 separate things. And like these tiny little like poetry song type things. One is about a nettle plant, one is about a footbridge, one is about a church door. And all 3 hint, or rather say explicitly, that she's not the true bride. And the prince is like, what are you saying there about not being the true bride? She's like, oh no, it's fine, I'm just thinking about something. And so basically, she gets married to the prince, and then the prince goes back to the ugly woman. He's like, "Cool, bride. How's it going? What was this story you told me about nettles?" And she's like, "I don't know anything about nettles."
I have to check my storage data banks.
Well, so she's like, "Oh, my maid knows everything that I think, so let me just go check with her."
She's my hard drive.
and yeah, basically. And she's like, and so she repeats this 3 times. Where the prince is like, hey, remember that thing you said about the footbridge? And she's like, no. And he's like, the thing about the footbridge. She's like, no, I didn't say anything about the footbridge.
You said a thing about the footbridge.
to footbridges. And she's like, oh, hold on. My maid has my thoughts. And so basically, long story short, eventually the prince figures this out.
Well, he lifts up the veil,
which
like, at some point you would think these people would just be like, I live in a world where I can't trust anything. People are jumping into baskets and shrinking all over the place. I really need to check on everything I'm doing. And so he finally lifts up her veil.
Yeah,
He's like, wow, you ugly. I don't think you're my wife. She's like, no, I'm totally your wife. I just had someone stand in and get married to you. Wait, oh, crap.
Right.
But the final proof after all of that is actually a necklace that he put around her neck at one point that she didn't have, and the maid did. So he's like, go get that maid. Let me see that maid. He's like, oh, she's beautiful. I'm going to go with her. Oh, and also she's someone I knew.
Yeah, basically. and she's someone I was betrothed to. She was someone that was locked up for 7 years because she didn't want to marry someone other than me.
Yeah, that part confused me in the story.
She's the one I actually married in the ceremony, which kind of means something.
Yeah, so as I was reading that story, I was a bit mixed up when it got to that part, because the beginning of the story is her not wanting to marry this person. She wanted to marry someone else.
No.
And
she did want to marry this guy, and her father was like, no, you're not going to marry the guy you want to marry. You're going to marry this other guy. And she's like, no, I won't. And that's why he locks her in the tower.
Well, no, that's the thing, though. It's like this person that she's marrying now is the one that she was betrothed to. She was not betrothed to the one she actually wanted to marry. So that guy's just gone from the story.
No. She was called Maid Maleen and was very beautiful. As her father wished to give her to another, the prince was rejected. But as they both loved each other with all their hearts, they would not give each other up. And Maid Maleen said to her father, I can and will take no other for my husband, which results in the imprisonment. And then the prince is like, well, I mean, she's in a tower for 7 years. I can't wait that long. So I'm out.
Oh, okay. I must have just gotten confused while reading it, because when it got to that part, I'm like, well, wait a minute.
There's a lot of confusion there because the person that he actually wants to give her to is never mentioned again. He doesn't have a name. He doesn't have any like actual role in the story. Like, she's in love with this one guy, and the king is like, no, you're gonna marry somebody else. And she's like, no, I'm not. And like, he doesn't even appear to have an idea of who the other person is. He's just like, no, not him. Anybody but him. And she's like, no, him. Anyway,
you can tell why some of these kingdoms fail miserably. Like they're poking a hole to look out, and they just see their kingdom destroyed.
These people are obviously heavily inbred.
Well, it's not just that, but it's like zero negotiation skills. It's just, I don't want to marry this person. Well, 7 years in the tower. I don't write the rules. That's just what we do.
That's how
so
it
it's
works.
like no sitting down to a table and like chewing it over. Nothing. Just like, get me some brick builders.
Make a tower, make it stronger than the rest of the kingdom, so that when my whole kingdom is destroyed by the enemy, that this tower still stands.
However, it can be carved out from the inside, which is exactly the opposite of what you want from a prison tower, but whatever.
By a woman who's been starving for 7 years,
eating nettles
inside the tower. Yes. Well, the nettles came later, because basically she gets out of the tower and she's like, well, we're out of food, and we don't have a kingdom, so I guess we're just going to walk. And they're like, what's those plants on the side of the road? Those are nettles. Oh, those are yummy. We're going to eat those. Don't eat nettles. They're not good for you.
I also like the part of the story where the guy is walking around the tower like, well, she's in there. Can't really do anything about it. Whatever. I'm out.
My version ends with, the tower in which Maid Maleen had been imprisoned remained standing for a long time, and when children passed by it, they sang, Cling, clang, Gloria, who sits within the tower. A king's daughter, she sits within, a sight of her I cannot win. The wall it will not break, the stone cannot be pierced. Little Hans, with your coat so gay, follow me, fast as you may.
I feel like that last line doesn't fit in with the rest of it, but whatever.
That's like the kids saying, okay, we're done talking about the tower, let's go have some fun.
But
I like the part about the wall will not break, because it totally did.
How did that conversation go exactly? It's like, oh yeah, I couldn't get in anyway. That wall was completely impregnable, and she's just like, we carved it out with spoons.
From the inside.
In the dark.
The prince was like, 7 years? I'm not going to wait that long. And then he marries some hideous person, or something like that. Or gets planned to marry some hideous person. But he doesn't marry her for those 7 years. So like, the whole thing doesn't make any sense.
That's a typical Grimm's fairy tale. There's very little in a lot of them that does make sense. It's basically just, this is like, it's almost like if you just wrote down your brainstorms, only better than that. If you just wrote down your brainstorms, it wouldn't be quite as fantastical and whimsical and dark and ironic, but it's definitely on that level of just like, I'm writing some thoughts down on a page. I think this is going to make for a good story, and there you go. The woman was on fire. He should have cried to put her out. Enjoy.
End of story.
It's almost like someone with a flair for the creative just wrote a bunch of entries in a journal. Every once in a while felt like writing something a little bit longer, and most of the time wanted to write something just a little bit short, and at the end of it you ended up with Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales, which, that's a perfectly legitimate way of writing something. Nothing wrong with that,
I guess. It works. They're classics now.
Yeah, they will long be remembered, and they will long be copied,
if not copied and switched around and flipped around and made more palatable or made less palatable in other ways. Stuff like that.
Yeah, the whimsical nature of Grimm's fairy tales is something I put in a lot of my short stories.
Yeah.
But the weird stuff happening, that's probably my favorite part about all of the Grimm's fairy tales. All the strangeness in the stories, Bones singing.
All the strangeness that's just ignored from its strangeness is like, this is normal.
Yeah, and it's being written, probably in a time when everything is going to be largely recognizable to the people reading it. And so it's just like, oh yeah, totally. We totally got people just, diving headfirst into baskets. And then there's these kids reading it like, does that work? Wait, what?
Can I do that? Yeah, she just has a talking horse for no reason. Oh, cool. I bet the talking horse does some really interesting things in the story. Oh no, it gets its head chopped off like immediately. Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Memories. I don't know. I don't even want to. Well, I don't know. Have you ever written any fairy tales?
Not really. No.
Yeah, I don't really. apart from that parody of Cinderella I did, I've written a few things like it, but I think that was just about the only real straight up fairy tale that I wrote.
Right.
It's like that and the Halloween story. That's it.
Sure.
Everything else is just references to fairy tales and so forth.
I would say that these are good to look at just to see how...
Just to see what you can get away with, if nothing else. It's like, these are world-famous stories.
Yeah.
So you can sit back and look at these. Like, in a lot of ways, it's just like, someone just sat down and wrote a few sentences down. But in other ways, it's just like, it's... Some of it's funny, some of it's not, some of it's murderous, some of it's weird, and it all seems to work, and it all works as a collection of things that I don't know. Virtually anything that that is written can be used as some kind of lesson to be learned about how to write things. And there's a lot to be said for how short and how concise many of these stories are, which, again,
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. Like, we have a short story that is literally one paragraph. And, it tells a story. A woman comes into a room, she catches on fire, and a man doesn't know what to do. The end.
And also the narrator's going to tell you what he should have done, but that's not what happened, so whatever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we talked about how the so-called rules of writing are usually just guidelines previously. And this is one of those cases where a lot of people, you'll get instructions from people going all over the place. Some people will say, make things as concise as possible, get rid of every single word that you don't need. And other people will be like, well, no, some of that makes the story more interesting and colorful. And they're both right.
Yeah.
You can approach these things from both directions.
So, have you ever read The Little Farmer?
The Little Farmer, who wrote it?
Grimm's Fairy Tales.
No, I probably have, but I don't remember it. I've read all of Grimm's Fairy Tales at some point, but I...
Oh, okay. So I just want to talk about this one for a second before we finish the episode up, because, like, this was a very strange story that like somehow was like, oh, this is interesting. Basically, a farmer is too poor to have a cow, and so he gets a wooden cow made for him, and then he gives the cow to a cowherd, and the cowherd sets it's a wooden calf, actually. Sets the calf in the meadow, and the wooden calf looks like it's eating, and then the day goes by, and the cowherd is like, man, that thing's still eating? I'm not going to carry that thing back. And so he walks off, and he's like, yeah, I couldn't get your calf back. It just wouldn't stop eating. And the farmer's like, oh, really? Well, I guess I'll have to go get it. And then someone stole it. And so he's like, I lost my calf because of you. And so he takes him to court, and the court's like, well, did you tell him you were going to give his calf back? And the guy's like, yeah, I told him I was going to bring it back, but it was just eating and eating. And he's like, well, you have to give him a cow. So now he has a cow. And so then then the cow grows up, and he kills the cow, and he takes its skin, and he's going to go sell its skin to buy more cows. And instead what happens is that he finds a crow, and he wraps the crow in the skin of the cow and carries it with him. He goes to a house and basically takes a break in a mill, and finds out that, surprise, the miller's wife is bringing in some other guy to hang out with her while her husband's gone. And then her husband comes back, and the wife, basically, as the husband knocks on the door, she hides all the stuff that she was going to give to the guy, and then hides the guy in like a linen closet. And the husband comes in, he's like, oh, I'm fine, I just want some bread and cheese. Oh, who's that in the mill? And he's like, oh, that's just some guy who needed a break. He was on a journey. And the guy's like, what do you do? He's like, oh, well, I'm a fortune teller. Oh, you're a fortune teller. Yeah, this crow will tell you 4 things, and then the 5th thing is worse. So let's have you tell the 4 things. And the farmer pinches the crow. The crow makes a sound, and the farmer's like, oh, the crow says that there's like cakes under the bed. And the farmer's like, oh, and the miller, sorry, not the farmer, but the miller is like, oh, there are cakes under the bed. There's salad in the bed? Yeah, there's salad in the bed. There's wine in the pillow? There's wine in the pillow. Okay, the 5th thing. There's a evil demon in the linen closet. And he's like, but you shouldn't look upon this demon. You should just like close your eyes and open the door, and I'll get the demon out. And so he lets the guy who was hanging out with the miller's wife out, and he runs out. And then basically the miller gives him $300 for the calf skin for the fortune telling, basically. And then all the other farmers are like, cool, we can get $300 for a calf skin? And so they all kill their animals and bring them to the shop. And the shop's like, I don't know what to do with all this calf skin. I blame the little farmer. And so they're like, okay, well, we condemn the little farmer to death. And she's like, what? Why did I... hold on. And they're like, we're going to put him in a cask and drown him. And he's like, hold on. And he finds a shepherd. And he's like, hey, shepherd, do you want to be the bailiff? And the shepherd's like, sure, I'll be the bailiff. And so he's like, get in this cask. And then they roll the shepherd into the water, and the cask sinks to the ground. And then the little farmer is like, hey, I'm here. I'm not dead. And they're like, how did you get out of the water? He's like, oh, the cask sank, and then there were sheep down there. And so I found these sheep, and I brought these sheep. And basically everyone in the town is like, really? Sheep under the water? And he's like, yeah, look, see? And they see the reflections of the sheep, or they see the reflections of clouds in the water. They all dive in and drown, and he inherits the whole village. The end. What the hell?
That's about as good as it gets. It's
It was.
I do remember the first part of that story. I also remember the very end with the sheep. I had forgotten everything in between that built up to that point, though. I'm not sure if... I mean, it must have been like 30 years ago that I read them all. But
yeah.
Yeah, that's... I don't know. That might be the craziest one. I got to read through this whole book again. It's been a long time, but it's...
So there was one other thing that I want to mention, is that how these stories have been changed. There's the Frog Prince, and I'm not going to go through the whole story, but the point that I just want to make is that in the Frog Prince story, it's not a kiss that awakens the prince. She throws him against a wall. Yeah. So, these are great little stories to read and, get a feel for, all this, unbridled whimsy and a lot of nonsense. And somehow they still end up being relatively coherent stories.
Relatively.
But
their incoherence at some points is what makes them great. In my book.
Yes, that too.
In their book.
In this book.
Specifically. Yeah, so the new one I've got is the Barnes & Noble Special Edition.
Uh-huh.
And it's based off of... Let me see here. This is the Margaret Hunt translation from 1884.
Okay.
So those stories might be 100 years older than that for all I know. But, they have guns in the stories, so I'm assuming that they can't be, 1600s or anything.
Well, so they're air guns, mostly.
Yeah.
Which actually were a thing back in the 1700s or so.
All right, well, do we have anything else to say about Grimm's Fairy? I mean, we can always come back and talk about some more of these.
We can come back and talk about some more of them at some other time, but, I mean, the point is these are classic stories, and the more you can understand classic literature, the better you'll be as a writer, just because you'll have a more widespread understanding of things that have become timeless, and that'll help you figure out what other things might become timeless. So, I don't know. It just seemed like a fun topic to go through because I've never really read any of these before, and so it was very fun to see how bizarre some of them actually were.
Yeah, so I think you can understand why I like them so much after reading some of the crazier ones.
Sure.
There is a lot to be said for early books. A lot of things were written the same just because there were only so many ways that people wrote, when people were writing the first works of fiction. And I don't mean going back all the way to Gilgamesh or anything, but just going back 500 years. If you read a lot of those old books, a lot of it might sound the same. And as you approach the 1800s, people were starting to get... There was more flavor to stories. People were writing in different ways, using different words. Language was spreading a bit more, and people were coming across foreign literature more often. And
yeah,
there's a lot more variation in the way things are written nowadays. And by nowadays, I mean maybe up to 2005, and then I don't know what happened. But nowadays, there's a big variety in writing styles, whereas there wasn't too much back when, a lot of things were first being written by scribes that were just copying things they already knew, and then people were learning to write and coming up with their own things and writing their own stories. People eventually realized that, I don't have to make, this is one of them things that makes it more of a guideline than a strict rule to follow. If you follow the strict rules of writing, you'll sound a lot like an old book that everyone kind of people sounded the same when they wrote hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. People
developed styles over time when it was realized that they could make their stories more interesting by doing so. It's kind of like there's piano players that will strictly adhere to the timing and the note falls of one of Mozart's works, and then there are those who will take liberties with Mozart and put their own spin on it. And then eventually you have people that are, they might have learned Mozart, but then they start writing their own music. And as time goes on, more and more people start doing that until you have modern piano playing, which is all over the place. All sorts of different styles being blended together until you have things that people wouldn't have even recognized, 200 years ago as music. Or rather, they would have recognized it as music, but they would have been like, what is this? This is weird.
Weird and new and strange, and I don't know what it is.
Yeah, so, which is to say nothing about old writing being bad. It's just that that's one style, and people have developed many more styles since then. And having a good grasp on...
And variations on old styles and things like that.
Yeah, and so having a good grasp on something like Grimm's Fairy Tales is, kind of key to seeing how that all develops. At least having a general understanding that things don't have to be the same. Like, if you're worried about writing not being good because, I read this author and I don't sound anything like that, or I look at like 5 different authors and I can't write like they write, I must not be any good. It's like, well, no, you're probably going to write different than anyone just because just growing up in a world that's full of so many different media, you're going to have hundreds of different influences, by the time you're 10 years old.
Yeah, well, there's another thing to be said about Grimm's Fairy Tales is that because there's such a large canon of them, you can actually separate out the ones that kind of stood the test of time and those that did not.
Yeah.
And you can learn stuff by making that contrast as well. Like, for instance, we looked at the elves, where part 1 of the elves everybody has heard, and parts 2 and 3 have been basically lost to time. We looked at Clever Gretel, which is kind of almost a comedic fable almost, but like we haven't really heard Clever Gretel in stories, but that same kind of moral that is in Clever Gretel shows up a lot, I think. But then we have things like Fair Catronelier and Piff Pop Poultry that are just lost to time. We didn't do any of the really big Grimm's Fairy Tales because I chose these ones at random out of a book that I have. But there's Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. There's Sleeping Beauty and Rose Red, Snow White and Rose
Briar
Red?
Rose. Snow White and Briar Rose.
Briar Rose, and yeah. Anyway, there's a bunch of these Grimm's Fairy Tales that have actually stood the test of time and been readapted multiple times. And you can look at those and compare them with the ones that did not. And you can learn things about what fiction works and what fiction works less as well.
Yeah, and another thing that to pay attention to is that these are stories that are so old that anyone can really copy them, and so you can take a Grimm's fairy tale and make your own version of it anytime you like. And that's kind of the point I was making before was you take what's already there and you develop it to your own style, develop something that you would write based off of it. You can write Grimm's fairy tale fan fiction basically, and because the stories are so short and generally threadbare, anything that you're going to write is probably going to go deeper into having more character development or things like that. And that's all, it's looking at a classic and learning from it, basically. Yeah, there's countless literature and movie adaptations of of tons of the Grimm's fairy tales. I mean,
right.
A good 50% of them at least have had some kind of adaptation in one way or another. Of course, it's not hard for it to be 50% when, 10 of them have a former princess selling pottery and having it trampled in front of her. So,
right.
But stories like Piff Paff Poultry, I feel like that was one of the brothers sitting down and just like, oh, this sounds kind of funny, and having a chuckle to themselves, and it's just like, okay, I'm going to write this down, and it's just. I don't know if it was something that was discovered years later or they actually seriously put it into a publication somewhere, but I really feel like a lot of their stories were just things they offhand wrote and never thought about again.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I think they were doing with Piff Paff Poultry was having these long names. And that was all they did, was they had these really long, ridiculous names, and they just listed them in a long list. I mean, there's that Monty Python sketch with the... what's that? He has that super long name, and
I don't remember the name. If you're asking me to remember the name, Jorgen.
No.
Jorgen something. I don't know.
You can look it up. If you look up the Monty Python long name sketch, you'll find it. I'll put a link in the description so that if you're listening to this, there should be a link in the description to a YouTube video that has this thing. But there's fun to be had with super long names, and Piff Paff Poultry is kind of like the very basic version of that.
Yeah, that's what I meant. It's one of the Grimm brothers sitting down and just having a chuckle to themselves, and it's almost meant to annoy the reader. It's like you read basically the same sentence over and over and over again for virtually no payoff. And then you get a joke about him being a broom maker?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's it. That's how it ends. It really is like a Monty Python sketch.
Basically.
Which is why at the beginning of this I mentioned that I consider this a great work of trolling.
Yeah, very much so. All right. I think we've got an episode.
Indeed we do.
This actually went longer than I thought, so this is good. We got some actual writing stuff in here, which is good for a writing podcast.
Yeah, we have no idea what we're going to talk about when we start these, so it's all good.
Well, this one we planned a week in advance.
By planning, you mean we read these stories, and then we sat down to do it, and we were both like, well...
We had a topic, which was 3 words, quote, Grimm's Fairy Tales.
And then when we started this, I said, so we're just basically winging it again, huh? And you're like, yeah.
Well, winging it is fine. It's just we have to talk about writing and not like, hey, I really like the sets in Aliens.
Yeah. Well, winging it is all we're ever going to do here, because I feel like that's when the best things happen. So we're not going to have much structure to these. It's just, here's what we're talking about. We'll figure out what to talk about. And just hope it's not anime 90% of the time.
Anyway, with that, we shall leave you for this week. And next week we'll have another episode of some random funny writing stuff, hopefully.
We'll pick a topic later.
Yeah, we'll pick a topic later. Anyway. Oh, well, so I'm not uploading these necessarily in order anyway. I just... Long story. Don't worry about it. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will see you later.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.